Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning in Credit Suisse event. And it is also a great pleasure to join my Uruguayan colleague and friend Jorge Fertis in this panel. So the idea this morning is to give you a broad idea, basically our economic vision in Uruguay, as Jorge said, how we stand in this volatile region that we have. So I would like to share this economic vision focusing on three main points. The first of which is Uruguay's government has a predictable and prudent macroeconomic framework. So this is very important as we move from the pandemic situation into the recovery. We continue to have very conservative and prudent fiscal policies, which of course go hand in hand with a debt level that is stabilized. So we are anchored in this fiscal rule. At the same time, we are not only looking at the stable macro economy, but we are also having this long-term perspective so that we are advancing in structural reforms, both not only the fiscal solvency, but in other areas, as we will see in the presentation. And let me, at this point, remind you that many of these reforms, they were passed in a law at the beginning of this administration in 2020. This new administration started in March of 2020. This law, the Urgent Consideration Law, was passed in July of 2020, and last year, in March, it was ratified in a referendum by our citizens. So that also gives us a lot of strength to move forward with our reforms. And the last point I would like to focus on this morning is we do have this macro stability. We have in place these structural reforms, and at the same time, this leads us to a very friendly environment to attract investment in the region, and I would say worldwide. So, and this destination for FDI in Uruguay, I would say it's based on safe. We have very clear rules that we respect throughout history. Rule of law, democratical values, low corruption, and so on. That also leads us to a strong social cohesion and having a very low country risk. We are also very market friendly. The government in Uruguay is very clear that it is the private sector that will bring up growth and that will create jobs. So it is our job to set the rules, to continue having this safe background and to have macroeconomic stability and to put forward the agenda so that we can attract investors, whether it's locally or internationally, and that we can grow and create jobs. So those are the points where, that we will be focusing this morning. Let me start with what has happened in terms of economic activity. As I said, the new administration took office in March 2020, the 1st of March of 2020, and just 2 weeks after that, we heard the first cases of COVID. So it was, like for all the planet, a very difficult time, and we had to choose the way how to safeguard the lives of our citizens and to save the quality of life of our population. And from the beginning, the government was very clear that we didn't want to go into a mandatory lockdown, but we chose the path of responsible freedom. Freedom is a very important value for Uruguayans. I would say it's part of our national identity. So it was based in this freedom that we implemented the whole process of how to sail through the pandemic. From the government, of course, we had to come up with support on the social front, sanitary front, health front, and also supporting by economic measures to basically support the small and medium-sized enterprises. And at the same time, this measure looked at keeping the social cohesion that we have, the strong social fabric that Uruguay has. Another important decision that we had to make based on this responsible freedom, as Minister of Economy and Finance, this was very important and was part of the discussion in the cabinet meetings we had at the beginning of the pandemic, is we cannot stop the engines of the economy running. There was a whole discussion with this point, but for us it was very important to continue economic activity moving. If not, what we have seen in other countries is that they went backwards and forward with this kind of decision, but Uruguay was clear on that at the beginning, from the start point. So what happened with activity in 2020 was a decline of 6%, around 6%. Then we rebounded in 2021 and we grew 4.4%. And for 2022, I would say that we are expecting growth to be around 5%. We don't have the final figures yet. The final estimation that we have, the last estimation that we have from the government is 4.8, but analysts, and we are also expecting to be just above 5% for closing last year. This recovery and this activity, although during the last months we have seen a sort of slowdown in terms of this recovery, but this activity has, of course, had a strong impact in terms of the labor market. And for us this is very important because as responsible of economic policy, ultimately what we look at is jobs creation. So we do see unemployment coming down. In fact, we have the lowest unemployment figure since 2017, and we see that formal jobs are increasing. A key engine of growth was external trade, and that this also spilled over manufacturing and other services. And if you look at the export of goods in the chart in front of us, we see the very significant performance of exports. That this is both driven by volume and by prices. Of course, we have the price of commodities going up. If we look at the destination of our exports, we see that Brazil accounts for nearly 14% of the exports of good exports of Uruguay. So it's a very major partner with us. It comes after China and after the European Union, which is basically European Union is mostly the same size in terms of market for Uruguay. Let me say that, what we basically sell to Brazil are vehicles, dairy products, malt, and plastics. And let me also recognize that Uruguay is seen as an agri-exporting and touristic country, and maybe many of you know us for that, but also Uruguay has become a major exporter in terms of global services. So in 2022, Uruguay exported around $3.3 billion of non-traditional services. So I'm excluding tourism and freights. So this is mainly IT within this non-traditional services. 3.3 billion is a lot if you compare to the export of goods, which was 13.3 billion in 2022. Let me now move into the macroeconomic policies. As I've said at the beginning, when this administration started, we had complained a lot about fiscal prudence. So for us, it was essential to have fiscal credibility and really put the house in order. Having said that, 2 weeks after we were in office, we had the outbreak of the pandemic. So the decision was, however, to implement a fiscal rule that has 3 pillars and to clearly separate in this fiscal rule what is structural expenditure and what is expenditure that you just have that is extraordinary, like is the case with the pandemic. In 2020, the fiscal deficit, this was the first year of our administration, increased to 5.8% of GDP. This is the central government's fiscal balance. This was estimated that would be the case, and this increase in the deficit is fully explained by the expenditures in terms of COVID. We were very focused with the measures to support the situation of the pandemic, different to other countries. All the expenditure related to COVID, they were encapsulated within a fund, the coronavirus fund. This was passed by consensus in Parliament. So this is very good for our accountability and to wind down the measures once we're out of the pandemic. So the evolution of the fiscal result is what you see in this graph. Last year, the fiscal deficit was 3.2. This figure was released yesterday, and all of these numbers, they are within the fiscal result, that the estimations for the fiscal rule that we present to our citizens and to Parliament. So for 3 years in a row, we are fulfilling our commitment in terms of fiscal prudence. In terms of monetary policy, what we see is the inflation target band that the central bank has. The administration again started with a good performance, bringing down inflation, but as part of the inflation in the world, as part of the consequences of the war and the expansive monetary policy in the United States, inflation in the world began to rise, and so was the case in Uruguay. However, we do see, as a consequence of a contractive monetary policy in Uruguay, inflation coming down, and you also see, and that is the line, not the dotted line, the continuous line, and then in the dotted lines, those are the expectations from the private sector, and those are also adjusting to a decline in terms of inflation. So let me now move into the second block to share with you that not only did we focus on what was going on in terms of macro stability and in terms of the pandemic, but we also always kept this long-term perspective. We said that we had also high-beam headlights on all the time, so that we have to look at the structural reform. First of all, the fiscal framework, as I've already mentioned, we have a fiscal rule with 3 different pillars. I would say maybe the most important one, at least throughout the pandemic, was to separate what is the normal fiscal result from what is the structural fiscal result. And we do have 2 different independent institutions, the Fiscal Council, which has checked that we are calculating the structural result within our methodology. And we also have an expert commission that provides us with inputs for the calculations. Very important also, we are going through a social security reform. This reform was presented in the urgent consideration law in July 2020, where a committee was formed to prepare a blueprint for the reform. And currently this reform has been passed in Senate at the end of last year, and we will start next Monday the discussion. Tuesday. On Monday, ministers, we have to go. On Tuesday, the formal discussion begins in the House of Representatives. So this for us is very, very important, because it does not only look at the long-term solvency of the system, but Uruguay is bringing up a much equitable, just system where the support is focused on the most vulnerable people, on the lowest income part of the population in Uruguay. And we also have designed this reform so that we have the correct incentives in place, so that people have the incentive to work, because every day worked is taken into account for the final pension that you get. And of course, this goes hand in hand with this idea of having a strong cohesion, social cohesion in our country. We are also going through a very strong reform in terms of education with a different curricula, preparing our young people for work so that we don't have two different areas. The curricula has nothing to do with what we expect later in life of the worker. And we are making this reform was also present from the beginning in the urgent consideration law, and we are making progress in that area. Then we have another reform that is very important for Uruguay, which is not part of the urgent consideration law, but I think that our president has been very clear on this point, and I think that we have had a very good meeting with the president of Brazil, with Lula, last week. Was it last week? Maybe I'm confused with the dates. Last week, I was not present because I was on vacations here in Brazil, but I know from the president that it was a very good meeting where the president made it clear once again that Uruguay is very determined to continue in the Mercosur bloc, which is very important for Uruguay, but that we need a modern Mercosur that gives its members the flexibility not to being obliged to work all of us together. We are 4 different countries, so we have to move at different paces. Uruguay, in that regard, we have finished a feasibility study with China, and as was said, we will work in parallel within the Mercosur and Uruguay with China from this feasibility study. And I think that both countries, that we are on the same we are on the same page in that regard, because ultimately we all 4 members of the Mercosur, we want more growth and more jobs for our country. In terms of the relation of Uruguay with, also on a general level, Uruguay has presented at the end of last year a letter to be part of the CPTPP. So we are starting that path. In terms of integration, it's not the results are not around the corner. You always have to work hard and to be able to wait for those results, but we are waiting and working. And at the same time, in terms of the Brazilian relation, let me stand out 2 important issues that from last year. In June of last year, Brazil and Uruguay reached a consensus on a broad agreement on trade in the products that are produced in the free zones. So the trade that is within the free zone of Uruguay and of Brazil, they are taken as if they come from Mercosur, and that is very, very important and wasn't the case before. So I think this is a very important a point for investment in Brazil and for investment in Uruguay. And the other important point last year was that Uruguay with Brazil promoted the reduction of the common external tariff that was finally approved at the end of 2022, and Uruguay in that sense reduced nearly 2/3 of the tariff lines that we had. Finally, in terms of reform, let me mention very briefly what we are doing in terms of mainstreaming environmental issues into our economic policy. Let me say that here Uruguay has also been very, very clear. And our message is that as government, as a country, we have to walk the talk. Everybody talks about environment, climate adaptation and mitigation, but what we really need is results. So we have been very, very active from the start of this administration. In our budget law for the 5 years of our period, we introduced an article where we say Uruguay is going to incorporate in its economic policy the adaptation and mitigation of climate change. We have a tax on the emission of carbon dioxide on gasolines that is around $120 per ton. That's very important. We have been very active both on two channels, I would say, on the domestic front and also on the international platforms that we have been. I was chairing the development committee of the IMF and World Bank last year, and we have been pushing with this idea that we really have to put environment into our economic policies. And in that regard, Uruguay has been very innovative in its funding. We have issued the first bond linked to key performance indicators, a structure, a two-way structure, where we receive an award or we are punished if we reach certain environmental indicators. These certain environmental indicators, they come from the NDCs, from the Paris Agreement. So they are very concrete, and the important point here is that we do have a consequence if we don't fulfill the commitments that we have in the Paris Agreement. Again, for us, it is important to walk the talk. This is going to be important not only for the well-being of our citizens and the planet citizens, but as responsible of economic policy, we have to incorporate this if we want to have more investment and more jobs created. So let me now move to the last block of this presentation. We presented the macroeconomic stability in our country. We presented the reform in the agenda that we have, the structural reforms in our agenda. And finally, let me say that all of this leads us to a country, as Jorge said at the beginning, that is ready and willing to receive investment from our citizens and investment from abroad. First of all, Uruguay is a very safe country. I sometimes say to investors, we are a sort of boring country because really nothing, we don't have volatility, nothing really big happens in terms of social unrest. We are very, very stable, and here I present a set of indicators that show the political stability that we have, adherence to the rule of law, how low the civil unrest indicator is in our country, and the low perception in terms of corruption. Let me add to that we this leads us, to having investment grade status, and at the end of last year, Uruguay reached its highest rating in its history. Here we present the rating that we have with different ratings, and the other side of this, which is very important because this is where people put their money, so they must be very confident in what they do, is that Uruguay has the lowest spread in terms of emerging markets in the region. You can see the blue line in the graph. So our MB spread is the lowest. These figures go up to 2022, but it is the same situation right now. So let me add to this safe environment that I've spoken about the S and the G in the ESG indicator, but we are also very focused on the environment issues, as I mentioned in the last of our reforms. And this leads us to have a very good score in terms of 61 countries that are evaluated by JP Morgan. We are number 4 in this 61 countries in terms of ESG. And also, let me mention that last year, Euromoney ranked Uruguay as number 1, the safest countries in Latin America to invest in. And as we see, this has led to a big increase in terms of FDI's inflows, and currently we are in more than 4 points of GDP in terms of FDI. We are a very market-friendly environment to receiving investors, again, both for abroad or from locals, because because they all receive an equal treatment. There's no local counterpart required in Uruguay to make business. There are no restrictions for the repatriation of profits. We have one country level tax system, very simple, and of course there's free foreign exchange market. For me, it's like strange to present these points because it's business as usual for our country, but I think it's worth remembering this because that's not the case in all countries. And finally, we have this safe environment. We are very market friendly. It is the private sector that has to create the jobs, but also we have to help this private sector. So I would say that we have a broad set of tax incentives, both for domestic and foreign investments, which make our country very attractive for investors. So we have added benefits to the law, the General Investment Promotion Regime law that has been passed many years ago. We have added more benefits with a focus on job creation and clean energy. And the result of it is what the chart that you see on the downside of the slide. We have received a lot of projects so that they sum up to more than $5 billion received so far. As I've said, we have different types of instruments, not only the investment promotion law, but we have the free zones, as I mentioned that we agreed with Brazil. We have the free port and the free airport schemes. We have PPP schemes, also agreements to work. We are very active in terms of public works and industrial parks and temporary admissions that also help us to promote investment. And last but not least, we have launched an innovation hub program to strengthen the entrepreneurial ecosystem in tech industry and sustainable production. First of all, we presented the resources in our last budget law. We presented a budget law for 5 years, but on an annual basis, we revised the budget law. In the last revision, we presented additional resources for this area, and I would say that this program goes along 3 different vectors: deep tech, green tech, and biotech. So for that purposes, we are developing venture builders and innovation campus to promote the development or the establishment of high-tech companies in our country. And of course, we are working to further promote and attract human talent. So I think that was quite a long presentation to share these main points with you. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much, Azucena. We received a set of questions before the conference. Please feel free, if you have any questions, also to make them directly. Azucena, I think, is ready to take on any questions that you might have, even if they're difficult. No problem at all. I think one of the interesting ones is we've seen Uruguay over the last years to attract a lot of tech companies and a lot of tech investment. So what incentives, or how do you see this sector growing? Is this sector that you see that it's going to evolve further enough, or what is Uruguay doing to attract more tech investments in the country?
Hello. Yes. So thank you, Jorge, for the question. So Uruguay has a very generous law, I would say, to attract tech investment. That has been going on for a while. So what we did in the last years, we added more benefits to the sector. So this has been, the tech sector is not new in Uruguay. It has been developed, and as I've said, the export of services from this sector is growing and growing. Maybe what would be new, I would say, is the focus on a second layer of tech sector. And this is something that we talk a lot with the Minister of Industry, is adding biotech adding tech into our agribusiness, adding tech to life sciences. That is the layer on which I think that we are mostly focused on. Maybe because we went through this hard pandemic that showed us how important it was to focus on these areas, and also what is related, the tech related to food. We know that it's very clear from what has been happening, not only through the pandemic, but because of the consequences of the war, the importance of production of food. And I think that Uruguay is in a unique position in this food production where we have to add technology. In Uruguay, we have like, at least the ministry, we have like simple rules. And one of the simple rules that we have is what we do good, do it in the best way possible. So we have comparative advantages in certain areas. In those areas, we have to add technology and we have to attract talent so that we do it as best as possible.
Lately, I mean, Uruguay, I know it's always been a country extremely open to immigration. We are aware that a lot of people have moved into the country lately, but we're also aware there have been some fiscal incentives or laws passed that have attracted people. Could you please elaborate a bit on what those laws are and what are the benefits of somebody moving into Uruguay?
That's right, Jorge. So Uruguay, it's a very open country. I mentioned during the presentation in terms of trade, but also as you are mentioning in terms of receiving immigration. And in that sense, we have added benefits, again, to attract foreign investors into our country so that we have more investment, more jobs creation. That is ultimately what we have to look at. So we had we already had in place some criteria to have the fiscal residence, that we call it, that was related to being in the country more than 180 days, having your core business or your family in the country, or having real estate for certain amount, $2 million, or having a participation of a company for around $6 million. What we did, we added more flexible conditions, looking again at employment and receiving more people. So what we added, that people could come to Uruguay if they purchase real estate after July 2020 for the equivalent to $500,000, being in the country for 60 days at least. And on the other hand, we decreased the amount of share that you have in a company to $2 million from $6 million, but you have to have a payroll of 15 people in that in your company. So again, looking at job creations. So it's quite easy to have looking at this criteria, it's quite flexible, the way that Uruguay is trying to attract investors, again, trying to have more growth and more job creations.
Thank you. We've seen investment in green projects in energy. How do you see Uruguay positioned globally within the energy transition, and how competitive you think that those investments have been to the country, and how investors can benefit from them?
Well, the counterpart of having presented how good we stand in terms of ESG and in terms of the MMCACI index that looks at the environmental pillar, I think I didn't present it, but we are very good scored in that index also. The counterpart is that we are going through what we call the second energy transition. Uruguay made a lot of progress in terms of renewable sources of energy, and now we are moving into the second transition, where we are paying special attention to green hydrogen. So we are having some pilot projects in Uruguay, and especially the Minister of Industry and Energy, he has been very active, going all over the world, trying to bring investors into this green hydrogen sector, where we see a lot of future, not maybe for the coming years, but with a longer perspective. So I think it's important that in Uruguay, in this stable environment that we have, the idea is the kind of investors that we're looking at are investors that want to have a long-term perspective, and that they come and they stay and they have good returns and good impact in the country.
Are there any benefits for investors coming outside of the region, or investors coming from the Mercosur region, or is it the same?
The benefits are from the fiscal residence that I mentioned before. So if you have a foreign investor that qualifies with a fiscal residence, there is a holiday, a tax holiday for the interest paid for the interests and dividends that are generated abroad. You can either choose to have a tax holiday for this tax for 10 years, or you can choose to pay 7% of the income from dividends and interest for the whole time.
I mean, the region is quite convoluted lately, I would say, no? I mean, what we say are the main reasons why Uruguay is showing these signs of stability or resilience, or what is it so different? I mean, you mentioned some things in the presentation, but there must be also something people would be skeptical. I mean, maybe this is temporary and all of a sudden it will sort of disappear. Do you think so?
I think what's behind the indicators that we presented is the people, the Uruguayans, and that is not by chance. I mean, one thing brings into the other, but for us, the respect of the rule of law is like something that we are born with that. If you see the political transitions from one government to the other, they are very, very smooth. If you look at what happened when Lula came into office this last month, the president of Uruguay came with two previous presidents, one from the party that is within the coalition in government, Partido Colorado, and the other, Mujica, a president that is from the opposition, that currently the party is in the opposition. So I think that speaks a lot about how Uruguay's population is. And I would say that another very important element that is within our identity is freedom. Uruguayans, we are born in this free environment, and I think that is something that we are very proud of, and that we work a lot to keep it.
So as an investor, if I'm considering to invest in Uruguay today, and there's elections in 2 years, should I wait or should I go forward now?
I think that you should go right now, and it doesn't matter. I would put it this way. All political changes in government, they are very smooth. Of course, I would really wish that the current coalition keeps its place in government, because the reforms that we are starting to implement, we see the results, but of course the major results are going to come in the next years. So for us it's important to continue with this coalition government. But once again, it is a boring country in terms that you won't expect any social unrest or political problems in that sense. So it is a very safe, market-friendly and attractive environment for investors. And you shouldn't wait, Jorge. We are ready to receive all investors today.
We talk a lot of investors, and that's a question that comes quite often. Finally, I mean, we have a few minutes more. I mean, in terms of, I think as a small country that is open to the world, has benefited in globalization, but we've seen a walk backwards in globalization or deglobalization. Do you think this will impact negatively Uruguay, or what measures is Uruguay taking in terms to counteract that effect?
That is, we have to take the external variables as they are, and what you are mentioning is right. And particularly, we see many countries that are growing the protectionism that they have. But as I've said during the presentation, it's not the case for Uruguay. Because of the size that we have, and because of the comparative advantages that we have, we need to open and to integrate to the rest of the world, not only in terms of trade, but in terms of investment, in terms of cultural exchange. So we keep a very active profile, trying to be as open as possible, receiving immigrants, receiving investors, and trying. We are sure that that is what will be best for our country and for our people.
You mentioned earlier that Europe was in talks and has been advancing in some negotiations with China. Why China? Why not Europe? Why not US? Or why not all together?
It's all of them, Jorge. So Uruguay has been speaking and with all countries. We want to be as open as possible, and we want to receive benefits for our exports. It was China that answered back and that decided to continue with this feasibility study. But for us, the way that we can further grow and create jobs is opening our country, so that it's not one or the other. As I've also mentioned, we presented the letter to be part of the PTPP. We and our chancellor is very active, going all over the world, saying really we want to make business with other countries. And an important point, Jorge, to mention is that as Uruguay develops and our GDP increases, remember that Uruguay has the highest GDP per capita in Latin America, 20 billion. So that means that we don't access anymore to the preferred scheme in the international trade. That leaves us out of those benefits that other countries with lower income have. So there's like a perverse system in terms of trade, that the better you perform, the less benefits that you have in terms of trade. So that is why we're working so hard with other countries to make agreements. And at the same time, we are having conversation with the World Trade Organization, in the Development Committee in the World Bank and IMF, so that we move into a different scheme where your environmental behavior is rewarded and you receive better access to markets if you have a better environmental performance. Again, trying to walk the talk in terms of environmental behavior. So my point is that currently, those countries that perform better, they have worse conditions for their markets.
So in that bond that you mentioned earlier in the presentation that Uruguay issued, is there any other country that issued a ESG bond in those conditions so far? Or has been the first Uruguay on that one?
This is a unique structure where you have two key performance indicators, and you pay a higher coupon if you don't fulfill your commitments. You pay a lower coupon if you overperform. Chile, at the beginning of last year, they issued a bond, but it was only they only had what you call a step down, so it wasn't a two-way structure. What we have seen in other countries are the typical green bonds, where the use of proceeds has to go to a green project. In this case, we are really like, again, walking the talk, because we do have a consequence if we don't reach the international environment indicators that the country has committed itself to
And the money does not need to go into a green project?
No, absolutely
proceeds.
not. The use of proceeds is like any regular plain vanilla bond, where the use of proceeds goes to budget. But of course, budget there means that you have to allocate those resources into policies that will bring you to reach, that will help you to reach this indicators that you have in terms of NDCs. And these two key performance indicators chosen, they were the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and they were the maintenance of the natural forestry. That is interesting that it wasn't an indicator that we first thought of, but investors around the world, they were very keen on choosing the conservation of the natural forestry.
We're running a bit out of time, but I have two more questions. I mean, is there any specific investor profile that you think will benefit more from investing in Uruguay than others?
I think that the investor that is looking at the long term, as I've said before, and government doesn't like to pick and choose certain sectors. Every sector is welcome to come to Uruguay. We don't have more information, or we are not more clever than the private sector, so it is within the private sector to choose those sectors. But of course, we have to think in long-term terms.
I mean, I've been here for a few days in Brazil with my colleagues in the office. I can tell you that everybody likes a lot Uruguay here. And I would just finalize with more an invitation. I mean, a thank you very much for coming here, and an invitation to be here again next year, if you can. And an extra invitation, if you can pass forward to your president. We'll be very happy to meet him here next year.
Thank you very much, Jorge. And let me say that it is a case for myself, but also for all Uruguayans, that we also like very much Brazil. So thank you, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much, all.